Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you to the Whip's office for giving me the time. I'm thinking tonight about the media consultant at my school gate, who cannot get a 20-hour consultancy contract because she can only work until 2:30. But 5:30 is the corporate norm, and she can't seem to disrupt that. I keep telling her, just don't tell them what time and you'll be fine, but she can't get back to work. That's a labour market activation issue. I'm thinking about the in-house lawyer in a corporate doing the exact same job as her colleague for 25% less pay, and knows that she cannot litigate, really, even though it's the law, because she'll get a name in the sector for having done so. It's easier just to ride it out, wait it out and leave when another opportunity comes. I'm thinking tonight about the professional women that I know, and who many will know, who shifted to 3-day weeks to manage the needs of their young families when their professional partners stayed at 5-day weeks, impacting their activity, their inclusion, their opportunity, their pay, their pension. And I'm wondering how many corporates in Ireland have a substantial number of their male employees with young children opting for a 4-day week for those very busy and very difficult early years. I'm thinking of the young women new to the working world who have decided to drive during the winter because the walk home from the bus stop or the train just isn't really an option, just in case. I'm thinking of all the women who have had gendered violence explained to them by men. I want to thank the men who have the awareness to back off when it's dark and cross the street, or take a different seat on the train or the bus, rather than crowd the space of a woman who is always vigilant because she has always needed to be vigilant. I'm thinking of the women who have moved out with their children under the cover of darkness to anywhere, except staying with a violent or abusive man at home, instead of him leaving. Today is 2 years since Katrina Bentley, long-time activist and now CEO of Men's Aid, and I held a rally in Dún Laoghaire against coercive control. We did it outside in the open air on the Dún Laoghaire pier to take it outside right into people's awareness. Of course, so many people already were well aware of the behaviour, and now they had a name for it. People on the pier told us that day, yeah, I know, my sister, my daughter, mother, aunt went through this. A common phrase came up, he had always been difficult, telling a story actually that left many women isolated and psychologically damaged in the long run. How very welcome the work of An Garda Síochána to successfully prosecute this offence of coercive control that people said couldn't be prosecuted because it was too nebulous, too based on subtlety and patterns and nuance. I want to congratulate An Garda Síochána on their work, and I want to thank them and all of those working to support people of both genders, but let's face it, predominantly women, experiencing domestic abuse, including coercive control. Because I'm also thinking tonight of the 2 women I met in my constituency who looked afraid at the door when the man of the house came on the scene while I was canvassing, who hurried off, who had to go suddenly. I'm also thinking of the women of the Phil Debating Society in Trinity College who I met last week, who made me both laugh and despair with their comic depiction of apologising for taking up space, physical space, for having an opinion, for wearing lipstick, for not wearing lipstick. I'm thinking of the politicians from all around the world, Julia Gillard, Ruth Davidson and others who contributed to the excellent online abuse programme on the BBC last night by journalist Mariana Spring, herself the recipient of serious online abuse. I'm thinking of all the people, but particularly all the women, and particularly all of the young women with high-profile jobs who have been the subject of social media abuse, of misogynistic efforts to silence them or undermine them or hurt them. The recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly are welcome and overdue. They set out a vision for change, but honestly, it's one that women didn't really need articulated for them because they have been living it for many years, those experiences. But it is so welcome to hear those experiences being articulated and, importantly, affirmed by Dr. Catherine Day and somebody of Catherine Day's standing, having been debated and agreed by the 99 citizens who worked so hard. It is totally appropriate now that their work be taken forward by their elected public representatives, and I want to take the opportunity to thank the Ceann Comhairle who responded and acted so quickly on my letter to him requesting a dedicated Oireachtas committee be established on this subject. And I similarly want to thank the Business Committee for their support, in particular to my colleague Deputy Government Chief Whip Deputy Brendan Griffin, Chief Whip Minister Jack Chambers for their help in bringing it forward, as well as Deputy Dennis Naughton in particular, and the National Women's Council for their huge help on this also. I'd like to see it established by the end of the year. I'd also like to thank everybody for their support, Deputy Holly Kearns, Deputy Ivana Bacik, Deputy Kathleen Funchion, who's mentioned it, Deputy Minister Josepha Madigan, and many, many others who have commented on the need to take this forward as soon as may be. I came as a councillor in Dún Laoghaire Rathdown, where there is a gender equal, essentially, county council. It's the only place in Ireland where girls can actually look and see an equality of representation. We know it isn't here in this House, and we should be embarrassed that we have been dependent on quotas or incentives to get to the 37 women that we have. Politics is important because the voices and the lived experiences of those people influence discourse generally, and crucially, the assumptions and the experiences on which policy is based. It is not enough to have women in the room or near the room when decisions are being made. Women need to be the decision makers, as often as men are, for there to be equality. So I might disagree with the Citizens' Assembly on one point in particular, and that is that budgets should be gendered proofed. I think it's insufficiently ambitious, and it continues to the ongoing othering of women, instead of being a society simply influenced equally by genders of equal genders. Budgets, I suggest, would not need to be gender-proofed if they were as often written by women as often as they have been and are written by men. And indeed, importantly, if the senior civil servants on the financial side of government were as often female as they are on the more state side of government in, for example, education, justice and other more state side, something I observed continually working in government. Similarly, many of these cultural issues would be different if childcare were perceived as a humans with children issue instead of a woman's issue. I was asked on radio a little while ago if childcare and the Dáil would get more women into politics. And I pointed out the number of men in this House who had recently had babies in their families and how they had not been asked this quite ridiculous question. I said it more forcefully in my head than I did out loud, and I rather regret that now, actually. If I could at this juncture mention my own private member's bill for providing temporary remote voting for members of the Oireachtas, providing support to people of both genders who have had small babies and need more time at home, or indeed for other specified purposes. I've talked before in this House about the imbalance in work done at home by both genders, highlighting the work of the European Parliament's Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, published in November 2020, which pointed out that women across Europe do 13 hours more each week than men on unpaid care and housework. And indeed, it pointed out that the closure of schools, care centres and workplaces through the pandemic, increased the unequal distribution of non-paid domestic and care responsibilities within the home for women who often, in addition to balancing working from home, were left without sufficient support for child and elderly care, and that obviously remote working is not a substitute for childcare. I've also spoken in this House about the urgent need to disrupt the cycle of gendered violence that our generation and everyone that went before us have experienced. How the only way to interrupt that for our children is to really properly interrupt the cultural norms that we have, that we continue to have, by a programme of relationship and sexual education that focuses from the earliest age on respect, consent, equality, personhood and boundaries. I note Deputy O'Donoghue's remarks in relation to teaching children from the earliest age that you can do any job and the importance of mindset. That's also important, but in many cases these norms are coming from a cultural perception of women and men, and the disruption is so important on both points. I thought Deputy Crow's contribution earlier was very interesting and important on this. He observed that the brilliant girls that he had taught changed somewhat in their teenage years, became perhaps less involved, less outspoken, but of course they do. When boys or men speak over them, take credit for their ideas, sexualise them without their consent, when mass media tells them that they must look a particular way to be perceived as acceptable or successful, when they must wear a skirt to school, when I can choose to wear trousers in the Dáil, is it not continually ridiculous? This is an important debate, and I want to thank everybody who has contributed to it. I also want to acknowledge my colleague Emer Higgins on her work on women in corporate boards recommended by the Citizens' Assembly. I see that research published in the Financial Times in August of this year highlights that in the UK, there had been an increase from a voluntary effort to achieve a better gender balance on corporate boards. But the counterpoint was, of course, that much of this was made up by the appointment of women as non-executive directors. About 90% were non-executive directors, rather than the more influential and indeed higher paid executive directors who tended to come from within the business. This debate is so important because if you're 22 and female, 23, 24, 25, and you have come out of college or you've come out of school and you're entering your career for the first time, you don't expect that this is what's in front of you. You don't expect that things could be different or should be different because of your gender, when you've done just as well as boys in school or college or everywhere else. And yet you come to discover that the cultural norms are different, that the expectations are different, that the fact of having babies interrupts the opportunity to have a continued career and ensures that you are perceived as different. I never ever thought coming into Dáil Éireann, that it would be the first time really that I experienced coming up against a gender wall. I was quite surprised by it, to look around and to see quite how few women there were here, that so many of the invitations that I receive are to speak about being a woman in politics, or the difficulty of being a woman in politics, or what it's like for women in politics, instead of asking me about literally anything else. All of those things, while I don't wish to complain about them in any way, I simply want to note that their very existence, or the precepts behind the questions, continue to other and make different women persons in politics from men persons in politics. Why am I not asked, why is Kathleen not asked, Deputy Funchion not asked about the government balance sheet, the separation of powers, a whole range of different questions when the invitations are continually about being a woman in politics? There's no question but that we don't wish to pull up the ladder behind us. That is not it, of course not, and I contribute to every single thing that I'm asked to do. I simply observe that every single time that interview request comes in, or the request to speak on gendered issues comes in, it takes me an hour, 2, 3, 4 hours away from being a woman person in politics who would like to be re-elected. And that the man person in politics has that 1, 2, 3 or 4 hours to spend simply responding to their constituents, getting through their call list, developing policy, legislation, preparing for media. It's simply an observation, but it is one that I think is important. And I see Deputy Funchion actually nodding at me there, and I thank you for your support, because I am somewhat nervous even articulating it. I don't know why, given that I'm a member of the House and should be entitled to say whatever it is that I believe on behalf of the women whom I represent, whom I know agree with this point. But nevertheless, here I am taking up that measure of space, articulating an opinion that's somewhat contrary both to the narrative generally and the feminist construction of what women might do in politics or should do in politics, or a feminist construction of same. And nevertheless, thank you for your nodding and support. Thank you, Cathaoirleach.